These two words are not interchangeable, okay? Biosafety defines the containment conditions under which biohazards can be safely manipulated. So the biohazard is what you're working with. The biosafety is the containment in the equipment, the facilities that you work with to work safely. So the objective of biosafety is to reduce the risk of a potential biohazard exposure to the lab worker, to the persons in and around the lab, and to the environment. So any questions so far? We good? Okay. All right, so we've talked about risk groups, and they are levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're really creative, those people at NIH and CDC, great minds. So now to confuse you even further, we're going to talk about biosafety levels. So biosafety levels are categories of lab operation that were developed by CDC and NIH for work with these agents that produce or may produce human infections. You'll never guess, but there are 4 levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that provide enhanced degrees of protection by increasing safe work practices, protective equipment, and containment facilities. Biosafety level 1 is your lowest containment level. Biosafety level 4 is your highest containment level. Your risk groups, they correlate with the biosafety level, but they do not always equal the biosafety level. What I mean by that is if you have a risk group 2 organism, probably 99% of the time you will work at biosafety level 2, but maybe not always, okay? That's why you do a risk assessment. You may be doing something with that risk group 2 organism, maybe that's out of the ordinary, that requires you to work at biosafety level 3. Maybe you are working in a piece of equipment that aerosolizes that risk group 2 organism, and we just don't want to take the chance of, by creating so much aerosol that you might ingest it. So we want you to work in a BSL-3 lab where you might wear an N95 respirator. So we up the biosafety level. Or the opposite may be in effect. Maybe you have a risk group 3 organism that what you're doing isn't super hazardous. So we look at your procedures and we say, you know what, we're going to let you work at biosafety level 2. Or you're working with an attenuated strain of a risk group 3 virus. So we say, okay, you can work at BSL-2. So most likely, if you work with risk group 2, you'll work at biosafety level 2, risk group 3, biosafety level 3, and so on, but not always. So again, that's the other reason for the risk assessment. That's why your protocols get reviewed by the Institutional Biosafety Committee, and we make those judgment calls and those assessments. So biosafety level 1 is suitable for work with well-characterized agents that are not known to cause disease in healthy human adults and are of minimal potential hazard to lab personnel and the environment. Some examples of things that you would work with at BSL-1 are soil samples, normal flora in humans, excuse me, Bacillus subtilis, adeno-associated virus, and most E. coli species like K12 or DH5 alpha. A biosafety level 1 lab is pretty basic. This is your basic microbiology lab, okay? It's usually an open workspace with multiple lab benches. You've got doors. These are the requirements. You have to have a door, okay? You can't have an open entranceway to a public labs or a public hallway. So you have to have a door for access control. It has to be easily cleaned and decontaminated. Okay, so no carpet, no wooden bench tops. Your bench tops have to be impervious to water and resistant to heat and chemicals. You have to have a sink to wash your hands. Okay, we're big on hand washing. And if you have windows that open, they have to be fitted with fly screens. The reason for that is a lot of recombinant DNA work is done at BSL-1. Okay? If you are doing recombinant work, we do not want insects to get into the lab, pick anything up, and take it back out into the environment. We don't want genetically modified organisms that shouldn't be in the environment out into the environment, and insects can carry those things back out into the environment. And then who knows what will happen to it once it gets out in the environment. We want it to stay within the lab. So most of the newer, or all of the newer lab buildings, at least here on campus, the windows don't open. Some of the old buildings, they do. So if you happen to work in a building where the windows open, we don't have a problem with them being open as long as they have a screen in them. Protective clothing at BSL-1 is your basic lab PPE. You should be wearing a lab coat, gloves, eye protection, especially if you're working with chemicals. And the cardinal rule of PPE is your PPE remains in the lab. You never take your PPE home for laundering. If you have a spill onto your lab coat, it either gets sent out to an approved cleaner for laundering, or it can be cleaned in the lab. If it's a biohazard spill, it can be cleaned in a lab sink with bleach. If it's a chemical spill, we recommend that you just dispose of it as chemical waste and get a new lab coat. Oops. Standard microbiological practices at BSL-1. Nothing real crazy here. Use mechanical pipetting devices, no mouth pipetting. Most of the time when I say this to students, they all look at me like, what are you talking about? Who would do that? Every once in a while, when I'm teaching a class that has an older PI, they look at me and they go, what do you mean no mouth pipetting? I still do that. So some people actually do mouth pipette. We do not like that. Obviously, there's a chance that you could suck something up into your mouth. We don't want you to do that. So we want you to use mechanical pipetting devices. Wash your hands. Hand washing is very important in the transmission of disease, or preventing transmission of disease. So anytime you remove your PPE, you should wash your hands. You should restrict or limit access when you're working in the lab. We don't just want anybody walking into the lab when you're working. Prohibit eating, drinking, smoking, or storing food or drink in the lab. This becomes an issue in some of the newer buildings where they've built the office space right into the lab bench areas. People want to sit at their desk at their computer and have their coffee or their breakfast or whatever it may be. Not allowed. You have to have it outside of the lab. It's unfortunate that that's the way they built stuff, but it's still a rule. It's a very bad practice, and we've tried to talk to most of the lab designers and the building coordinators to try and find spaces outside of the labs where you can have lounge areas or lunch rooms. But at a minimum, you have to have a little table outside in the hallway where you leave your coffee or your waters or whatever it may be. Minimize splashes and aerosols. Decontaminate your work surfaces every day. So when you're done working, you need to wipe down on your work surfaces. Decontaminate your waste appropriately. And then maintain rodent and insect control program. That's not anything that you as a lab worker need to worry about. That's done at the building level. What you need to know is if you see insects or rodents in your lab that don't belong there because they're not part of your research, you need to let your building coordinator or facilities person know so they can call in the exterminator, because we have a contract for that. Okay, so that's BSL 1. BSL 2, which is the environment that most of you will be working in, is suitable for work with agents of moderate risk to personnel in the surrounding environment. The main hazards are self-inoculation or needle sticks, ingestion, or mucous membrane exposure, so splashes to the eyes or mouth. Examples of things that you would work with at BSL-2 are things like human herpes virus, salmonella, human source material, and adenoviral and lentiviral vectors.